Hello, Nicolette. I can
yes,
see
we can all hear. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. My name is Zhuqing. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Johannesburg. It's my great honor to moderate this session, Trade and Reform in Africa. We have 3 papers in our session. Each paper will have 20 minutes to be presented. I will remind you when 5 minutes left and 1 minute left. We will have 50 minutes to discuss after all presentations. And also you can write down questions in Q&A box anytime during the session. Let's start. And the first presenter is Nicolette, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I just want to try and share my screen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
I don't think so. Did you show the screen?
Thanks very much to TIPS for having me today. This presentation is based on a research report for SARChI that was published in February 2020. So this is prior to the pandemic. And the report itself, the full report and related research, can be found on the SARChI website under the Economic Diplomacy Research Program. So just by way of context, there's been increasing interest in recent years in the role and position of the services sector and services trade in structural transformation and development. Contributing factors include the share of services in GDP and employment, growing trade and services, as well as the importance of services for manufacturing, including services value added as a share of manufacturing production and exports. Now, alongside this, there's been growing pressure to liberalize services trade in North-South trade agreements and the launch of services trade negotiations in phase 1 of the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiation process, while we also have ongoing services negotiations at the regional economic community level on the continent and in the tripartite free trade area agreement. I'm not sure if you can see the slide on the right-hand side, which just highlights South Africa's share of services share of GDP and employment. While the increasing services in GDP and employment conceals a wide range of activities from high-tech to survivalist and poorly remunerated work. So the high shares that we see may reflect premature deindustrialization or tertiarization, and this has led to controversy over the services sector's position in contemporary development strategies. Now, it's related as well to the important view raised by Arkebe of the centrality of manufacturing in the industrialization process, with industrialization broadly defined. While there's not enough time to discuss this debate fully, a key lesson is that the health of the services sector is related to that of manufacturing. And in the current value chain context, it is the interaction between manufacturing and services activities that's important for development. Now, against this background, the main objective of the study is to examine the growth and structure of Africa's trade and services and the importance of services trade policy formulation and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement negotiations on trade and in services. Now, services trade data measurement issues are very complex, and we have to build up a picture of services trade and trade potential using a variety of different sources. These include balance of payments data, trade in value added, and specifically services value added as a share of gross exports and manufactured exports, foreign affiliates statistics, services shares in FDI, and in this paper we add the proportion of listed companies on African stock markets in services sectors to have a broader picture of the services landscape. The paper also considers the openness of services sectors and issues related to measuring so-called services trade restrictions based on GATS commitments and the World Bank's STRI. What the paper aims to do is provide a set of recommendations for developmental services trade strategy. And due to time constraints, the remaining slides will focus on the picture built of Africa's services trade and some key issues related to the Continental Free Trade Area negotiations. Sorry, I've just lost my slide here. All right, so the World Trade Organization's General Agreement on Trade and Services identifies 4 modes of international supply of services across borders. The first of these is cross-border supply between residents and non-residents. The second is consumption abroad, followed by commercial presence, mode 3, and then mode 4, the presence of natural persons. More recently, the trade and value-added literature has discussed mode 5, supply of services, to take account of the delivery of services embodied as inputs into traded goods. This is very important for the focus on regional value chains in this forum. All right, now services trade negotiations and final schedules coming from these negotiations tend to be organized by the 4 GATS modes of supply, but balance of payment statistics on their own are not adequate for capturing and identifying these 4 modes. In particular, they don't capture mode 3, supply of services via commercial presence, because multinational activities count as resident activities, inverted commas. So to provide a fuller picture for trade negotiators, there is a guiding framework for collecting and reporting services trade data, the 2010 Manual on Services Trade Statistics. This is an initiative of a number of international organizations, including the UN, WTO, OECD, and IMF. Countries are encouraged to apply a simple allocation of information gathered to the 4 modes of supply. However, countries are at very different stages in applying these guidelines, and this complicates comparative analysis, particularly among developing countries. Furthermore, for developing countries, it's not clear that reprioritizing scarce resources to collect or organize information in some of these areas, such as outward foreign affiliate statistics, makes sense at present. The priorities of domestic statistical bodies may be very different. So the takeaway here is that pressures on developing countries to gather information in a way that is prescribed by outside organizations are often linked to a particular narrative structure. In this case, the accompanying structure is found in the mainstream literature on services trade and trade in value added, which argues that the best thing that developing countries can do for their services and manufacturing sectors is to liberalize trade in services. However, we will argue that a developmental trade strategy for the services sector needs a more nuanced approach, and that services trade strategy and services regulatory cooperation on the continent does not equate to a call for regional services liberalization. Right. In the study, the examination of the services trade on the continent, or trying to build a picture of services trade on the continent, we focused on 18 African Union countries, of which 8 are SADC members, 5 are non-SADC tripartite FTA members, and 5 are other AU countries. The examination is done from South Africa's perspective largely, but the choice of countries were guided by countries that are active services traders on the continent, as well as market size, GDP per capita, and membership of regional groupings. The countries include a good mix of, in terms of income levels and GDP status, LDC status. Okay. Now, what we have in this table 3.2 is just an extract from what we found in the paper, and it highlights the major services traders on the continent. If you look at the left panel, as South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco. Angola and Nigeria are major services importers with the largest services trade deficits, circled in red on the slide. And Nigeria and Ghana are upcoming services traders on the export side as well. Now, what is interesting is to drill down to key subsectors at available extended balance of payments levels, which you see in the right panel, well, I hope you can see it, for a number of selected countries. Note, however, this is a major problem with the balance of payments data, is that even these sectors are extremely heterogeneous. So if you take the subsector technical, trade-related, and other business services, which are critical for the Angolan and Nigerian services trade deficits, this particular subsector includes a wide range of diverse activities, as diverse as architectural design and waste management services. So there are 2 key points here. We need survey work or case study work to look at which categories of subsectors such as technical, trade, and other business services are driving these trends. And another important point from the South African perspective is that while it seems there will be scope for increased services trade in once a services agreement is reached in the AfCFTA, it is clear that South Africa will have competition in key services sectors that it exports on formation of the services trade agreement. All right, a different picture of the importance of services trade for these key trading countries is provided in table 3.3. Once again, this is just an extract of that table. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it shows you a different picture in the sense that once you look at services trade as a proportion of GDP, you see Mauritius and Mozambique having the highest ratios, while South Africa and Nigeria have a very small proportion of services trade as a share of GDP. All right, the paper computes trade complementarity indices, which look at potential trade and services between South Africa and selected partner countries. The bilateral trade data that exists between African countries is very hard to come by. There are estimates in the BARTIS database put out by the WTO, but trade complementarity indices sidestep the problem of weak bilateral trade data because they examine the overlap in the structure of a country's exports to the world and its partner countries' imports from the world and vice versa. It also takes away the scale issue by looking at shares. Doing this on the basis of shares. So for each bilateral relationship, for each of South Africa's bilateral relationship, 2 TCIs are computed, one on the export side and one on the import side. All right, the results between South Africa and selected partner countries are given in the slide that you see. Services export TCI is highest with Tanzania, Mauritius, and Nigeria. This means that South Africa's services exports to the world matches best with the structure of these countries' imports from the world. So this is trying to give you a sense of trade potential between the partner countries. Then South Africa's services import TCI is highest, interestingly, with Kenya, Egypt, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. And this suggests that the structure of South Africa's services imports from the world best matches with these countries' services exports to the world. Okay. Now you'll notice that the TCIs are relatively high, or you could say that they are overinflated by the aggregation issue. So it's important for future work to try and get a better breakdown at the subsector level in the other EBOPS categories in order to avoid having indices based on data that is over-aggregated. All right. The picture of services trade that we've looked at thus far is based on the balance of payments data. For the case of South Africa, we highlight the services, the trade, using the trade and value added database of the OECD and WTO. We highlight the issue of services value added in gross exports. And the idea here is that the share of services exports in total exports understates the contribution of services to international trade. So the TIVA database allows a breakdown of the value-added content of trade into domestic value-added and foreign value-added content, and then also by sector. In the OECD database, only South Africa, Tunisia, and Morocco are in the database from the African continent. For South Africa,
5 minutes left.
Thank you. For South Africa, the graph compares services value added as a proportion of gross exports, which is the dark blue line, with services exports as a proportion of gross exports. Okay. So we see that services value added as a proportion of gross exports is nearly twice the share, twice as large as the share of services exports as the share of gross exports. What the figure then does is it decomposes services value added as a share of gross exports into domestic and foreign services value added. That is your blue dotted line and your green dotted line. Now the mainstream TIVA literature argues for the benefits of an increasing foreign services value added as a share of gross exports as part of its trade liberalization agenda. This rationale is seemingly based on the assumption that foreign services value added will be comprised of higher value added or higher productivity services activities. However, this position would need to be critiqued and interrogated from a developing country perspective, and the value-added composition of domestic services value added and foreign services value added examined properly. From a developmental perspective, an increase in domestic services value added and a change in its composition towards higher value added and higher productivity activities would be an important part of a country's industrial policy agenda. All right, now what is not shown on the graph is a sectoral breakdown of the domestic services value added and foreign services value added as a share of gross export. Allows us to look at their relative importance in a wide range of sectors and subsectors across the economy. Now, in the case of manufacturing, we find that for South Africa, domestic services value added is relatively high in sectors like paper products and printing, textiles, clothing and leather, motor vehicles, food, beverages and tobacco, and electrical equipment. Foreign services value added is much lower than domestic services value added, but relatively more prominent in motor vehicles, other transport, electrical equipment, computer and electronics, and chemical and pharmaceutical sectors of manufacturing. All right, so now further investigation into the estimates of the significance of services value added in gross exports is interesting because of the insights it yields on the importance of services for manufacturing exports and in regional and global value chains. All right, I'm going to have to skip over a few of these slides. In terms of the picture of services trade on the continent, the paper does discuss an exploration of mode 3 supply of services. In the absence of foreign affiliate statistics, we look at the importance of services FDI on the continent. And South Africa is not the only important source of services FDI on the continent. And the paper does highlight a number of important aspects. Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, and Morocco are found to be important outward investors in their particular regions. And the services in total FDI on the continent for 2018, the share was 44%. And the paper also highlights the importance of emerging technology hubs on the continent, especially in South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. This section of the paper, just very briefly, also highlights the importance of services companies in on selected African stock markets, listed companies on stock markets, and the sectors that they belong to.
1 minute left.
Provide a different picture. All right, so what I'm going to do with my last minute is to skip over the section on the openness of services sectors on the continent. Basically, the discussion sought to illustrate the wide range of GATS commitments undertaken by countries on the continent. And the reason for that is because the GATS commitments form the basis of the African services trade negotiating landscape. In terms of the services trade negotiations under the AFCFTA, one couple of interesting points that I want to highlight before I move on to the conclusion is that embedded in the documents for the AFCFTA negotiations, both the guidelines and the services trade protocol, is something that's quite unusual in the services trade negotiating context. And that is that the objectives of the services trade protocol explicitly highlight industrialization and the development of regional value chains in the discussion document. Okay. Issues we'll have to take up in the discussion. Uneven starting points for the negotiations, I've already mentioned. Undefined terms like minimum threshold required in the negotiations and substantial liberalization. Parallel negotiations in regional economic communities that will be taking place simultaneously with the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations. And the importance of collaboration with regulatory bodies at the national level, as well as industrial policy at both national and regional level. Okay, so just to move to the concluding recommendations. On the last slide, alongside a greater availability of services trade data at a more disaggregated level, more work is needed on the skill intensity, value added, and
time's up. Could you please conclude everything very quickly?
If I can just conclude my last slide.
Yeah, please. Thank you.
The productivity levels of traded services activities. So in examining the ability of services to contribute to structural transformation and the development of regional value chains, it's important to be able to distinguish higher value services activities, particularly those that are important facilitators of industrial activity. And the last 2 points from the perspective of international trade negotiations on trade and services and the pressure on developing countries to open up their services markets, developing countries should track what is unfolding in the plurilateral trade negotiation landscape and ensure that national, regional, and continental frameworks are developed before negotiations in North-South configurations take place. And in particular, further work is needed on the implication of current trends in digital trade and the challenges of the digital economy more broadly in this regard. There's some conclusions on the Continental Free Trade Area negotiations, but we can always take that up in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, let's have the next slide. Thanks, Barbara. Okay, in terms of Africa's population growth, which is predicted for the next 30 years, projections are that it could treble in size. Now, to put this into context, this is roughly equivalent to the current urban population of Europe and North America combined. So that's a lot of urbanization happening in a very short period of time. And with that urbanization comes a lot of hope in terms of structural transformation, if industrialization can be promoted along with it, in terms of integration into global and regional value chains, and just in general, the economies of scale and reaching households and improving basic living conditions. But of course, it's not that simple, because the relationship between urbanization and economic development is not an automatic one. And we see in Africa, many of the cities are plagued by infrastructure shortfalls. Cities are congested, they're crowded, they're polluted, and they can be really expensive. And most recently, we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic that the density can even be deadly. So can urbanization be harnessed for development? We certainly see that African countries need to spend a lot of public money and need to essentially invest if they're going to turn this density and this urbanization into productivity. And I think the African Development Bank works out that it could be as much as 130 to 170 billion dollars that are needed per annum just to meet basic infrastructure needs. So South African firms arguably have a opportunity here, or a competitive advantage, in that South Africa is fairly advanced when it comes to our level of urbanization and our cities. And we've got capabilities in terms of engineering, architecture, building bridges, roads. So do South African firms have an opportunity to support urbanization in Africa? Is there scope for services trade essentially to support infrastructure development in the rest of the continent? So our paper is focusing in on this basket of tradable urban services and what the evidence is for it. The next slide. So Nikki's already introduced a discussion around the relative advantages of manufacturing versus services. And I think that too often there's this dichotomy in terms of an either-or relationship, when we know that a lot of the value addition that goes on within manufacturing is actually embodied within service-based processes. So for a competitive, for industries to be competitive, they arguably also need a competitive support ecosystem in terms of services. But I think it's useful for us to take a step back and think about the different ways in which manufacturing versus services could play a role in industrialization and economic development. And I don't have too much time to touch on this, so I'll go quite quickly. But just to say that in four ways in particular, manufacturing has improved really critical and strategic in promoting structural transformation. The first is that products are tradable, allowing governments to tap into a wider market and boost growth. So in other words, if you're a manufacturer, you've got endless demand. If you can be competitive, essentially you just export it over your borders and voila, you're accessing a massive market. And this is critical in terms of growing your economy. The second advantage of industrialization has been that the processes themselves are easily standardized and scalable, which makes many low and medium skilled jobs possible. So creating a lot of employment in the right area. Third, products and processes benefit from technological change and productivity growth. So we see that there's generally unconditional convergence for manufacturing firms around the world. If they can compete, they generally reach equal levels of productivity. And we see that through the specialization, through the standardization, economies of scale, manufacturing companies become more and more competitive over time. And the fourth is that even if we might be skeptical about the number of jobs that manufacturing industries can create directly, there's a lot of indirect benefits for firms that up and down the value chain and upstream and downstream activities. And so in all these ways, manufacturing has a strategic role to play. But services also have a different kind of role. And I think there are three different ways that services have an advantage which manufacturing firms might not necessarily have. The first is that the firm's presence in export markets helps to strengthen in-country institutions. So it's the nature of the way in which the services trade takes place, is that it cannot happen at an arm's length. And so it often means that firms are getting involved in the country's markets at which that they're exporting to, and this can help build capacity in the process. And so even the types of services that offer can be tailor-made and specialized to better service the needs of the particular environment which is taking place. The second thing is that training and capacity building can occur in those host nations. So tradable service firms often need to actually create a local presence in that particular country they're operating through. So often it happens through joint ventures. And so there's this opportunity for tacit knowledge to be exchanged and the capabilities embedded within that country being built up. And then lastly, the position of firms within local and global value chains is often instrumentally related to service firms. So if we think of clothing and textiles, the manufacturing component of that would all be outsourced to typically Asian countries. But these firms would keep the design and the marketing elements within the developed countries. So, and if we think about infrastructure development, if you are designing the infrastructure project, along with that comes a lot of power to influence and capture value rather than just being an implementer. So we think, I suppose the overall message here is to say that both manufacturing and services play a critical role in structural transformation, albeit in different kinds of ways. Okay, next slide. So in terms of the methods for this paper, I'm going to present both a quantitative and qualitative evidence. On the quantitative side, we look at the FDI markets database. So tie back to what Nikki was referring to. This is the mode 3, where firms are actually establishing a commercial presence in another base. And it only focuses on greenfields FDI. In other words, this is not just takeovers. This actually represents new business, which arguably comes along with jobs and exchange of knowledge. It's from January 2003 to August 2019, and there are 492 projects in total. This is only a partial picture. Arguably, the media monitoring that takes place to construct this database would be biased towards the bigger projects, but it's in some ways the best information we have in this domain. And then the qualitative section is a handful, or more than a dozen interviews, as well as looking at the SA media and website analysis. Okay, next slide. So what's really surprising, at least to me, is that when you look at the FDI markets data of South African firms investing in other countries in Africa, you can see that it is heavily biased towards services. In fact, if you look at just the number of investments, it's 73% of all FDI projects were related to a service-based cluster. This can swap around a little bit, whether you're weighting it towards capital or weighting it towards jobs. The capital and jobs numbers are often quite modeled within this FDI database. So, you need to sort of take it from where it comes. But the story doesn't really change. Services and service FDI is actually a large part of the story of what's going on in terms of reaching other African markets. I think that in particular, finance and telecommunications within services make up about 45% of all FDI in the database, and finance alone is about a quarter of all FDI. Construction is particularly important if you wait towards jobs, next slide. Okay. So I've got about a minute before I hand over to Ivan. You can see this is the spread, and it's not looking so good for some reason on the Zoom slideshow. And needless to say, if you can see the green African map, that's for all FDI projects. And you can see there's quite a wide spread, but it's weighted towards neighboring countries. So proximity seems to matter, as well as the size of the market. So you can see places like Nigeria, Ghana, are more important. But if you just look at some of the clusters, the one in the middle is for, I think, metals and commodities. A fairly low number of projects. So these are, the investment that takes place is generally much larger in size, whereas the final picture, which I can't see, was for financial services, and you'll see it's much wider the reach. Okay, and my final slide. So just to reiterate some key messages, looking at FDI Markets database, you can see that South African firms have been actively investing in other African countries. It includes a wide range of industrial and commercial enterprises and support functions, but services do stand out as a major component of this, not a subordinate function. And this might be surprising in light of the fact that services aren't strongly supported in terms of reaching other markets. In particular, it's financial services and telecoms that are really widespread. Construction, this construction service industry is more important, weighted towards jobs. And maybe just to end off to say that services are embedded within traditional industry clusters. So it's certainly not an either or story. So Ivan's going to carry on talking with our experiences around a more focused discussion on advanced urban services from the interviews we did. Thanks, Ivan.
4 points. I've just got 4 slides. There's not much time. So we've interviewed a number of companies, and we've also done sort of quite a lot of analysis of websites and media reporting of what's been going on. Beyond the sectoral breakdown, it's critically important to distinguish more fundamentally between low value and high value services. This has already been mentioned by Nikki. Much of what South African companies do is relatively low value, routine types of activities. So building shopping centers, operating retail services, selling things, opening bank branches, providing household insurance, cell phone services, logistics, freighting goods around between different countries in Africa. These kinds of services are driven fundamentally by underserved consumer demand. South African companies have recognized that African populations are growing, that the middle class is, although still very, very small, is expanding, and have tapped into this demand through various consumer services. They're pretty simple, these processes. They're relatively standardized, they're scalable. If you open one bank branch, it's not that difficult to open another 20 or 30. So that's a very different kind of activity from the high value technical services based much more on know-how and deep understanding. So engineering, surveying, design, project management, consultancy, these would be the examples of these kinds of high value technical services that we think are much more important because their impact is on the productive capacity of countries, and this is what we're most interested in. These in Africa, as a sweeping generalization, have been driven above all by government infrastructure spend in the last decade or two, rather than by businesses or by commodity producers. Fundamentally, government is the customer. This makes them pretty complicated, bespoke. In other words, each one is different, each project is different, and the process of procurement is often opaque, in some cases outrightly corrupt, in other cases based on relationships that are long-standing, that are hard for companies to penetrate and access. There's also another complication, that the procurement of these projects is influenced by foreign funders who often bankroll these projects, and they try to favor their own domestic suppliers of these knowledge-based services. In addition, there's rising competition from foreign business services to access African markets. So that's a big challenge for South African companies. Next slide, please. So South African, it seems from our preliminary evidence, that South African companies have expertise in depth in a number of areas with huge potential for expansion. So consumer services I've mentioned for different market segments. So South African companies have got experience of serving high upmarket and low cost downmarket customers. In financial services, enormous strength in depth in South African banking and insurance, and in other kinds of financial services, telecommunications, logistics, property development, construction, engineering, civil mechanical engineering. And of course, this reflects South Africa's long experience of development and its upper middle income status. South Africa has been doing these things for decades. South Africa has been providing these services and developing these capabilities for decades. So compared with many other African countries, there is enormous strength in depth. South Africa has extensive infrastructure. It has its cities reasonably functional. It has deep property markets. It has a well-developed financial system. So the capabilities are enormous. So if we look at then, next slide, please. Basically, we don't think South African companies have fulfilled the potential. Nikki's data and other data analysis we've done suggests that although the numbers look quite impressive, as Justin was suggesting, as a share either of South African exports or as a share of the service penetration in other African countries, South African companies are not big players by and large. And the problem has been that Africa is a riskier environment than South Africa has been for a variety of reasons. Competition is rising, and many of the consumer markets in Africa are very volatile. So three particular problems have been increasing competition from other entrants. Turkey is a big player, for example, in retail chains. You may be surprised about that, but there has been increased competition from Turkish producers against ShopRite and Spar and other South African companies. Commodity prices have been very volatile, as we know, oil prices and so on, and this has had knock-on effects for currency fluctuations. This has been a big challenge for South African companies, managing their operations in other African countries and ensuring that they're making a profit and can balance their supplies with the revenues and so on, and currency repatriating their profits. And thirdly, the shifting rules of the game. So things are changing quite rapidly, have been changing over the last decade or so, with the growth of global players in these sectors and with pressures to localize. So governments have recognized that they have an opportunity to favor local suppliers and are looking to skew the rules in favor of local producers rather than companies coming in and grabbing their share of the market. So in a nutshell, and this is very brief, of course, but our sense is that South African companies have been slow to adapt to these changing conditions. They have been rather complacent, and they've not been very competitive. And we're not got to the bottom of this, so we'll be interested in people's reactions. But part of the problem has been South African companies being opportunistic as a generalization. They've pursued an extractive approach to the African markets. So for example, in the case of business services, they've tended to fly in and fly out their professionals, their surveyors, their architects, their technologists, their financial experts. They haven't invested in in-country expertise. They haven't taken that. They've gone for the short, low-cost, quick buck kind of approach rather than investing in local capabilities to build relationships and establish credibility in these markets. They've also, secondly, tended to go it alone. They haven't collaborated with each other to the extent that you would find, for example, among Chinese companies or among companies from other parts of the world, where they form alliances and joint ventures and work together to minimize the risks and to share the rewards. They have, in many instances, used other South African suppliers, though, professionals they know, building materials for construction companies, supermarket chains using South African goods, rather than investing in the local capacity to gain credibility in these countries. Fourthly, they've been vulnerable to the obvious criticism that they're extractive and that they're not developing productive capabilities. And they've been very vulnerable to that. And this has been a problem because they've been exposed to be following, in some cases, a sort of colonial approach to development in other places. And that's come back to bite, to damage their reputation. So their experience has been very mixed. We've got some
1 minute left.
got some big successes such as ShopRite and Spar in terms of retail, MTN and Vodacom on telecom, Standard Bank, ABSA and Sanlam in financial services, Imperial Logistics on logistics, obviously. These have been successful on the whole, with some occasional problems, but generally successful, but also many failures in construction. Group 5, Murray and Roberts, Atterbury, Basil Reed, property developers, Hyprop and Attack have had serious problems and has almost bankrupted in some cases their African operations, their South African, their overall business in South Africa. So my last slide now is we believe that there's scope for improvement here, that Africa, as Justin has mentioned, is a long-term commercial opportunity with a rapidly growing population, expanding consumer markets, expanding productive base. But it's a long-term thing, but it's an imperative. It's not just a commercial opportunity. I think this is a critical thing. It's a social and economic imperative for South Africa to invest in developing capabilities in the rest of Africa. It's a win-win. It's a mutual beneficial arrangement. It's not just a one-off commercial benefit, which justifies government taking this much more seriously. Urbanization could be a burden if it's largely slum urbanization, or it could be a massive boon if it creates the productive platform for economic development and structural transformation to take place. The South African government has generally been indifferent, particularly to services.
Time's up. Could you please conclude?
1 minute.
Yeah.
South African government has been indifferent. In fact, it has produced guidelines to discourage South African service providers on the basis of their reputation of being one-sided and extractive. It hasn't, though, offered an alternative, a constructive vision for what is possible, what might be possible. We think what's necessary is a targeted approach. Different African countries, different sectors, different territories need different ways of intervening and acting. We need to think not in terms of projects and particular sectors or customers. We need to think about value chains, building productive clusters, and building connective infrastructure, not just the odd dam or power station. That requires patience, it requires commitment, and it requires coordination. These are the kinds of things that we haven't seen enough of from South African companies in the last decade or two. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And
But mostly I'm actually focusing on the context because I think we tend to look at what other countries have done, but we don't really talk that carefully about how we translate that to Africans, specifically to the region, although obviously the last two papers have been a major contribution there. Having said that, I don't talk a lot about services, partially because, and I do think we could have stressed this a bit more, the data on services, trade and services tends to be really bad. So some of our major trade and services with the region is education and healthcare that people come to South Africa for. That counts as an export, but it's very difficult to quantify. And our trade statistics really don't quantify it. And I think one of the things to start with that is important to note is that, SADC countries tend to be smaller, both in terms of population and in terms of GDP, than other developing countries, if we exclude China, because of course China dominates all the data on developing countries because they're so big. So the GDP of the average SADC country is about 1/5 of the norm, and the population is about half the average. And what that means is that South Africa really dominates the region in terms of GDP, although its share has fallen, but it still accounts for around half of the GDP for the region. And this is also important for us because it means there's much bigger disparities between South Africa and its neighbors compared to the other BRICS. And that obviously has big implications for our trade and our ability to ensure mutually beneficial development. So our GDP per capita is almost 8 times as high as that of SADC, of the rest of SADC. For other BRICS, it's about between 1 and 4 times as high. And of course, what that means is two major things. Firstly, it means that the local export markets for our products, the regional export markets for our products, are just much smaller. But also it means that we don't get the kinds of synergy around infrastructure that you see most notably in Asia. So Vietnam as a low-income country is able to fit into value chains, but also logistical chains that are simply not available for South Africa. And you can see this, I mean, obviously most visibly when it comes to undersea cables. But another thing that we tend to, I think, neglect is just how unequal the region is compared to the rest of the world. Although I do sometimes wonder if we aren't just more honest about it. But what you can see is that 7 out of the 13 countries that have reported Gini's over 50 are in SADC. And of course, deep inequality in itself leads to slower growth, regionally as well as at the national level, because it leads to contestation over policies, over ownership, as well as fueling crime and reducing demand for regional products. Another thing I think it's worth noting, and I do think this is where we can say we also differ substantially from even other parts of Africa, is very high dependency on mining and fuels. And I do think that makes it much harder to pursue a consistent industrial policy because it also fuels inequality and because of all the issues around path dependency. And the one thing I want to flag, though, which I think is also important when we talk about industrial policy, is that really you see that light brown, that's the share of exports. Sorry, this is all about exports. That the manufacturers as a percentage of exports is extremely low in SADC outside of South Africa. South Africa itself is not that far off other American developing countries. And from this standpoint, Asia is actually an exception, whereas we tend to treat it like all other developing countries depend on manufacturers. In fact, truly, Asia is exceptional in that regard. And maybe we need to explore how that happened and what's different. But what is true is that the region has relatively little dependence on agricultural products compared to extractives if we look at other developing countries. And I should say one thing that we tend to neglect about South Africa is that outside of the auto industry, where we're very much integrated into the global economy, almost 40% of our manufactured exports go to the region. That includes both consumer and capital goods. The auto industry, of course, is our only major export industry that is not based in mining directly. And I think one of the things that, when we talk about the rapid growth in the region, part of and the slowdown in the last 5 years in South Africa, but also regionally, it is very much linked to the international metals price cycle. So we tend to ignore the fact that the metals prices, this is in constant dollar terms, that metals prices hit a 30-year high in 2011, and since then they have come down, and with COVID-19 they've come down even further except for gold, although they've since recovered somewhat. And what that means is that if you look at South African growth, sorry, you can see there where the circle is, that's the 30-year high. So a lot of the slowdown in growth, particularly since 2015, was the adaptation to lower metals prices. Remember that metals still account for metals and coal account for over half of our total exports. And what you can see with South Africa, but you can see with the region, is many countries, there's a very close correlation between the price of those export products. In this case, this is a trade-weighted index of platinum, gold, iron ore, and coal, which are our top mining exports. There's a very close correlation between those prices in US dollars and growth in our GDP. So when we make it seem like GDP growth is simply a policy issue, obviously there are objective factors there that affect it. If we look at existing trade within SADC, though, and this is where I think we often underestimate really how important the region is to us, particularly for industrialization. Outside of auto, around 40% of our goods trade exports go to other SADC members. So if you look at fuel, electricity, and minerals, all the SADC region doesn't export that much to neighboring countries. But if you look at South African manufacturers, you look at food and beverages, you look at things like clothing, the region is very important for us, although these are not our major exports. So if we're looking at industrialization, these countries are disproportionately important. And then I just want to talk a little bit about how we think about value chains in this context, because we talk a lot about regional value chains, but I think we don't often realize that that's actually a qualitative shift from how we normally talk about value chains. And I think the keynote sort of demonstrates the difference. That if we talk about the concept of value chains and industrialization really originated with this concept of global value chains, where the idea was that manufacturing production was moving from the global north to the global south, and again, particularly to Asia. And the real questions that were asked were, how do multinationals maintain control initially? So how do they use contracting and marketing and branding and all of those things to maintain control of production when they don't own the actual production sites? And of course, one of the classic relationships there is Foxconn and Apple. But it also became a question of how do we move up the value chain? That is, how do we regain some control locally and increase value added within our own economy? Part of the problem is it doesn't apply well to mining, where you moving up the value chain is a very hard thing to understand, and where mining companies often still own the sites, despite companies like Glencore. But also it doesn't help us think very much about production for local and regional markets, where you don't have the dominant multinationals, for instance, controlling the maize trade or the soy trade in Southern Africa. Second way people think about value chains is in terms of the role of small business. And the argument is, if small businesses can get into the global value chain, they can access global markets. And from this standpoint, you see multinationals as providing support to SMMEs rather than as exploitative. And the role of policy becomes, how do we address access to the global value chain, for instance, by improving infrastructure, setting standards, improving information about markets, and so on. And of course, the example everybody always uses in Africa is Kenya. It always worries me when there's just one example that we cite over and over again. And then there's value chains and industrial policy. And again, the reason I'm raising this is because I think we tend to blur these concepts and act like we're talking always about the same thing. The moment we say value chains, we mean global value chains or not. But when we talk about value chains and industrial policy, we're really saying, how do we analyze the blockages to growth in an industry and understand it in terms of the, at least in part, the upstream and downstream linkages? What are the constraints in terms of input prices, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of access to markets? Where are we located in, where is the industry we're looking at located within its value chain? And would it help if we unblock, for instance, upstream producers rather than focusing on growing manufacturing capacity itself? And what are the multipliers and so on? If we look at regional value chains, then in terms of this discourse, really what we're saying is, how do we think about regional production for regional markets? And I would argue it is a qualitative shift from saying the core of industrial policy is how do we get into global value chains? That for a country like South Africa or for any other country in SADC, when you're trying to get into regional value chains, you're actually looking at very different kinds of questions. So part of the issue is that where we would agree with the global value chain analysis is that national markets in many developing economies, and particularly in Southern Africa, well, particularly in Africa, are too small to achieve a competitive scale. So as we noted, Southern African economies tend to be particularly small compared to even other developing countries, much less to high-income countries. But also that rather than saying the solution is just to go into global markets, the implicit argument, usually implicit behind regional value chains, is that if we're trying to set up infant industries, it's easier to compete on regional markets than globally. So basically, like any other infant industry, the argument is proximity makes life easier. Producers are more able to develop capacity over time if they can use local and regional markets where they have an advantage just through proximity, and then they can build that up in order to compete globally. This is particularly important for SADC because we're latecomers. When Korea or China entered these markets, they didn't have the same kind of, we now have to compete with them, and they're much more established and have much more capacity than we have. But the argument is also that we can promote specialization within the region so that we get to economies of scale within the region. The trouble is that that's a lot easier said than done. And I really think when we talk about regional specialization, which is implicit in regional value chains, that there are actual and opportunity costs in the short run, and that we are effectively arguing that they are less than the benefits in the long run. But the nature of policy is people who lose out in the short run are often much better at lobbying than everybody who might gain in the longer term. The opportunity cost is largely, particularly for South Africa, is that in effect, if you do these value chains, you have to say, we won't pursue every project. If we wanted to develop a viable clothing industry based on economies of scale in the region, not every, right now, every country has some food processing, some clothing. We produce soy. Should we stop producing soy so that we can import it from Zambia? Or should we start importing chickens from Zambia? Then what happens to our chicken industry? These are not easy projects to talk about. So simply saying, here's an opportunity for specialization and exchange often doesn't get us very far. But there are also direct costs that we've really not managed to invest in despite all the talk. And the main direct costs are we'd have to fix up the regional infrastructure, we'd have to fix the trade facilitation, and we'd have to agree about what we're going to do about regional immigration. Most people agree that you can't have increased trade integration if you don't allow increased labor integration. And for South Africa, often we would have to decide this is an investment in future industrialization because it's very unlikely we can develop if our neighbors are so much poorer and we don't have infrastructure to work with them. But there is an upfront cost. And obviously there are risks, and it's easier just to keep doing what we've always done. And I think something we also tend to underestimate is that just coordinating policy across the region also takes capacity and time. And as Ivor said, there is a certain amount of volatility in the region at a political level, which also makes it more difficult. So for instance, we need to fix the border crossings in SADC. Everybody agrees on that. It pretty much doubles the transport costs because of the delays. We've been talking about this for at least 20 years. And we just don't come up with ways to do it effectively. And I think that points to the difficulties that we face. So in sum, what I'm trying to say with this is, firstly, we need to take into account the realities of Southern Africa, which is that it is not the same as other upper middle income countries. The countries are smaller, they have lower incomes, they have more inequalities, which tends to get in the way of growth. But that's also why regional integration would be more helpful. If we're serious about doing regional integration, we have to firstly be aware of why we think that would help, how a regional value chain approach could help, but also that there are very serious socio-political as well as economic obstacles, and we need to address them rather than just sort of continuously saying we should just integrate more.
Are these the questions on the Q&A, right? Yeah. Should I address the ones on the Q&A first? Can you hear me?
Hi.
Okay, so from Cici, sorry. There's a view that with the continued decline of manufacturing sector and its contribution to GDP, government should rather divert resources to services. What's your view, and would you support this? Well, I wrote an answer to the effect that there are indeed strong arguments for the centrality of manufacturing in the development process. But in my view, industrial policy needs to pay attention to industrialization more broadly defined, including the industrialization of freshness, which you can read about in our Kebe, John and Chris's book on economic development in Africa, as well as the interaction between services and manufacturing in the value chain context, which was discussed in my presentation and in Justin and Ivan's presentation as well. So this doesn't mean, like Justin was saying, that there's an either or. It doesn't mean that resources should be diverted from manufacturing in industrial policy. It just means that our industrial policy can have a broader focus. Right, that was the one. The second question was on the African Continental Free Trade area agreement? Is it making a significant contribution in increasing interregional trade? And my answer there was that it's too early to tell. Implementation was due to begin on the 1st of July, but has been delayed due to the pandemic. Trying to think, I think there's another one, another question for me. Prof, yeah. It says, how do we include services in a wider industrial policy? As most of these sectors operate in private sector silos that are largely untransformed and not growing quality employment. That's the kind of, it's a huge problem with finance. That's a debate that's well known. And I noticed that in the reimagined industrial policy that was presented, we attended a TIPS presentation, I think, on it. It might have been part of Apport towards the end of last year. I saw that tourism was included as part of that reimagined industrial policy. But I think that you need to have better coordination and collaboration between the department responsible for industrial policy, as well as the part of DTIC that's involved in export promotion. I think a lot more could be done working with export councils in terms of bringing in services sectors into the trade and industrial policy debate. And yeah, I don't want to, I've run out of time, but there are a couple of other suggestions in the paper in that regard. Thanks.
Straightforward to see which questions are for which presenter. I see two questions here. One from Farai. It says, how can African companies leverage on urbanization to drive and support industrialization? And a similar question from Kinga. How can urbanization promote structural transformation in Africa? So those are two very big, high-level questions. And I think, Ivan, you'd probably have more wisdom to share. Why don't you chip in on that question for us?
Thanks, Justin. So the key point is that urbanization brings people and businesses closer together. Proximity, we've already heard in SADC, is an important advantage. It's an even bigger advantage if firms and households are really close together in dense, functional cities. That's the key point. They need to be functional and not just a density per se. It enhances productivity enormously. There's a huge amount of evidence now around the world for the productivity benefits of cities. Three key arguments. The first one is shared infrastructure. You can easily imagine how you can pool the costs of infrastructure if your companies are located in one place. Roads, rail, we've heard about undersea services, undersea cables. All kinds of infrastructure are much more efficient to deliver where your users are concentrated geographically. Secondly, the matching of skills and labor, demand and supply. You can have, by having a large labor pool, you give firms much more choice and you give workers much more choice of employer. And that leads to considerable advantages for productivity and efficiency. And thirdly, learning. If your firms are concentrated, they learn from each other, they improve their productivity over time from competing and collaborating, and that's a significant advantage in the long term. So that's the key point. The urbanization is critical to Africa's structural transformation. It has not received sufficient attention, and as a result, we have cities growing that are inefficient and unproductive and squalid in many cases. 60% of African households in cities live in slums, in effect, which is really not acceptable socially or economically. There was a question about skills and the export of services. I'll take that one too briefly, and Justin, you can come in too after I've said. So basically, skills are critically necessary if you want to export services, because for high value services, it requires know-how, expertise, technical knowledge, and this, of course, you need these capabilities before you can hope to export these services. But there are a whole range of other relatively low-tech services that can be exported. Tourism would be a good example in Africa. A relatively low-tech, high labor intensity. It's a service that's been destroyed by the virus, but it should and could bounce back if conditions are favorable, as we've already heard this morning. Transport is another relatively low tech service industry. It requires countries to develop their freight systems, their infrastructure, of course, but also companies that can, through warehousing and through increasingly the use of technology too, with managing these things to maximize efficiency. This is critically important. So there are a number of low-tech services too that are important. We've heard about sort of public good type services, education and health, never mentioned. I think there's a huge potential here too, that South Africa has actually neglected around higher education that could be much more successful.
Great, and I think there's one more question here from Ayanda talking about shifting away towards higher value added within manufacturing. And I think it's important that if South African manufacturing is going to be more competitive, it'll certainly come along with more competitive service industries. So, for example, consulting, engineering, these management companies can get paid quite a lot of sums of money to come and look at productive processes and see how you can reorganize them. And the flows of information that happen in the process of manufacturing firms getting on board new capital, etc. The service firms are critical in enabling that transfer of knowledge and enabling the new capital to flow into the manufacturers. So certainly it's hard to imagine how South Africa's manufacturers would become more competitive if not off the back of a supportive service environment. Yet critical in terms of moving up the value chain is what I'm trying to get at. Okay, I think that's enough from us for now. Thanks.
I think we should not underestimate how terrible the data are on service exports. So I see there's a question that says, for instance, services are a small share of GDP, of exports and of GDP. Service exports are a small share of GDP, but we actually don't know, because services can mean South African companies provide services overseas. We may never know the value of those. They can mean people come to South Africa and consume services like tourism. We may never know the value of those either. So we don't count the value of the very large number of foreign students who are in South African universities. Many of them from the region, but some even coming from outside the continent. Yeah? Same thing for healthcare. I mean, before COVID, I'm told the Westcliff was full of people getting facelifts in South African hospitals. I don't think we have any sense at all of how much money comes into the country as a result. And remember that in many ways, South Africa, since the late 1990s, has functioned a bit like an offshore financial center, which I would argue is a form of services export that actually gets in the way of more equitable and sustainable growth. But that's been hugely important for our political economy as well as for the economy. And again, very hard to quantify. Yeah? So I think part of the problem is we don't really know what's going on with services because our statistical framework was set up for goods, and it just doesn't deal well with the globalization of services. Having said that, then one of the questions is, how do we then get to specialization and exchange? And I do think it's important that we ask that question, and we ask, what are the so that we can look at the factors in terms of the economic interests of the countries and where they align in the long term, but also where there can be contradictions in the short and the long run, but also at the governance structures that could possibly manage some of those problems. And our experience is, and you can see it in the SADC industrial policy processes, that they remain extremely vague and they avoid taking on the hard questions. Part of that is because even within our countries, we often don't have states that are able to manage conflict very well in a way that looks at the long-term government interest. So it was interesting in the keynote speech where it was suggested that countries that do well on industrial policy, that's helped them do well on dealing with the pandemic. You could also argue that they just have governments that are able to deal with the facts and confront conflict in order to act on the facts, and that is equally helpful in industrial policy and in dealing with the pandemic. And without that kind of evidence-based policymaking and willingness to manage conflict rather than avoid it, I don't think we will be able to get a regional industrialization policy that makes sense. Having said that, I do think there's a lot of scope for bilateral deals, but again, you have to show how they're mutually beneficial, at least in the long term. And there's lots of scope for improving infrastructure. And in the context of improving infrastructure, trying to ensure that it doesn't just lead to greater, the problem with any kind of improvement in factor mobility is that the strongest countries can just get much stronger and the weaker countries lose what they have. Yeah? So if we're serious, so I do think the thing South Africa can most obviously do is assist in developing things like more reliable electricity, water, sanitation, and transport, and communications across the region. And that would actually, in the medium term, would be a vast boon to South Africa itself, just because we have the resources to assist. But we would have to be sure that the result isn't just that all of manufacturing moves to South Africa, at least all of high-level manufacturing moves to South Africa, and all labor-intensive manufacturing moves to other countries, because I don't think that would benefit anybody in the longer term either. I don't know if I've gotten all the questions, but I do think that, you can't assume that we can fix all of this through industrial policy. I think we have to look at, through a comprehensive industrial policy. Sometimes if we can get the policy-making strategy right, we can learn as we go along.
I thought it's not a question really, it's a comment, but Neva, thanks. You took the words out of my mouth. But I have questions because I work also in the same space of, my name is Vuyo, I'm with the HSRC ISA. I work in the same space of AFCFTA and regional value chains. And I'm left asking the questions, having looked at this, I'm left asking questions, both as a researcher and sometimes dabbling a bit into practice. How convincing are we with our policy advice and from research that you said the SADC industrial policy doesn't ask the hard questions? But my also question is how are we as researchers not also brave enough to say those controversial things? For instance, are we able to go in and tell, let's say, the SADC level, and retune Sanjay Lal's song of different, not only many roads to heaven, but also different heavens, to tell them that regional integration will, in the long term, or medium to long term, benefit you. So you must know that at the beginning, there will be winners and losers, and the value chain literature says that. But it is how it is integrating, the choice is no longer integrating into a value chain. It's about how you do that. And so at the end of the day, tell them, advise that it does not mean that if you integrate in activities that are low return, it means you can stay there. You can always upgrade, and there are many ways of upgrading. The second issue is, yes, I know this borders, when you talk about industrial policy, it borders, it extends to the issue of selecting winners. Are we brave enough as researchers to suggest winners? Which, like you were saying, we can't compete in everything. We can't do everything. Can we really say we can go into ABC because of our comparative or competitive advantage, whatever you want to use? And also, there's also issues that we can preach. The issues of trade in components, which we have seen grow quite a lot in the Asian countries. And then the other issue, and I'll finish now. The other issue that is a common question, so we can discuss this, because I think that most of what has been said, most people working in this space are familiar with. Then the other issue that is quite frightening, which Ivan brought in, and I also did research in Tanzania some time ago, almost 11 years ago now. The issue of South African firms going into African countries, as he used the word parachute. This thing has been described so severally. And once again, we come up short of offering, of even suggesting tangible solutions out of it. Not the generic ones, they should work with the local issues. How? I think this is where our research should go. And I'm not saying, and I'm not in any way taking away from what has been said, but I think we need to push it a little bit further and ask ourselves, how can what we have been suggesting for the past, I don't know how many years, how can we take it forward? And we start pushing the debate to another level. But overall, I wish to congratulate all the presenters. It's quite interesting. And I think the first one, if you looked at the trade complementarities, one of the tables, if you looked at the trade complementarities between South Africa and SADC, you can tell that there is not much. It's always South Africa exporting to these countries. But you know that these people also need to.
Because our time is very limited, so could you please just short your question?
Okay, that's it. I'll end there. I don't.
Thank
I'll
you.
end there.
I just want to say again that I think, to be clear, I don't think that it's enough to say we want to advise our companies how to act. I think we need to say the point of industrial policy is to say, how do you shape the incentives so that you're effectively managing companies to do what you want? Yeah? And that's actually the role of industrial policy. And part of the problem is there's no point putting in incentives that are just completely contradictory to the other economic pressures or social pressures on the companies. So I do think that if we're serious about regional industrialization, we should rather start by saying, what do we think South African companies should be doing differently? So you listen to what Ivan was saying. You know, how do we get our companies to behave the way we say they will behave? Because part of our comparative advantage in the region is our neighbors expect us to behave with more solidarity than foreign companies. It's not that our companies are worse than other companies, it's that we expect them to be better. Yeah? And I think part of the issue is how would we get to that point where they actually do play a developmental role, and that would create a basis for trust where we could then build on to get to a more regional integration. But I think part of our problem as government is to be very aware that in multilateral situations, you actually have limited power and the ability to reach strong agreements is weak. I think it's worth looking at the EU, where after all, they started with the agreement on steel in the early 50s, and they still haven't reached full integration, although they've done better, but they started very small. They started by saying, how are we going to manage the steel industry? And I think if we could also think rather about how do we start small instead of always trying to come up with the overarching industrial policy, we might do better.